Jake Morrison had been working at the research station on planet Kepler-4 for 2B for 3 months now, and nothing exciting had happened during that time at all, and he was starting to think that nothing exciting would ever happen here in this remote. A corner of space where the red sun cast strange amber light over everything and made the crystal forests outside glow like they were made of colored glass and fire. Combined into something both beautiful and alien at the same time, the station was supposed to be empty except for his small team of researchers who were studying the soil and the atmosphere and trying to figure out if humans could ever live on this world someday in the distant future when Earth became too crowded or too polluted or too dangerous to sustain the billions of people who called it home and needed somewhere else to go. Jake was heading toward the storage bay to grab some equipment for the afternoon sample collection when he reached the door and pushed it open, without thinking twice about it, because why would anyone be in there? And why would he need to knock on a storage room door in the middle of an empty research station where only 5 people lived and worked? The moment the door slid open, Jake froze completely, and his brain struggled to process what his eyes were showing him because it made no sense at all and violated everything he thought he knew about reality and physics and what was possible in the normal, everyday world. A woman knelt in the center of the storage bay, and she was surrounded by floating orbs of violet light that pulsed and throbbed in rhythm, with her breathing like they were alive or connected to her somehow in ways that science could not explain. And the orbs cast strange shadows on the walls that moved independently of their light sources. The woman was not human, and Jake knew that immediately, without any doubt whatsoever, because her skin glowed with a pale luminescence like moonlight captured and made solid, and her ears were long and pointed and emerged from beneath hair that looked like liquid. Silver had been poured over her head and allowed to flow down her back in waves that seemed to move even though there was no wind in the sealed room. When her eyes snapped open and fixed on Jake standing frozen in the doorway, he felt his heart skip several beats because those eyes burned with an inner fire that was both terrifying and beautiful at the same time, and they were the color of molten gold, like twin suns had been captured and placed in her skull to serve as windows to her soul. But the woman was not the thing that made Jake reach instinctively for the sidearm at his hip. Even though he had never fired it in his entire career and had only worn it because regulations said he had to, and he had always thought it was silly to carry a weapon on a peaceful research station, the creature coiled around the woman was what made fear spike through his nervous system and flood his blood with adrenaline, because it was a dragon, and dragons were not supposed to exist outside of fairy tales and fantasy stories and the imaginations of children who still believed in magic. The dragon was roughly the size of a large wolf, but every scale on its serpentine body gleamed like polished obsidian that had been carved by a master craftsman and then enchanted to drink in light and reflect it back in shimmering waves of deep purple and blue that hurt to look at for too long. Its wings were folded against its sides, and they looked too delicate to support flight because they were made of translucent membranes stretched between bones that glowed faintly from within, like they contained their own internal light source that was independent of the violet orbs floating in the air. When the dragon raised its wedge-shaped head and fixed Jake with eyes that matched its master exactly, he felt the temperature in the room drop by what must have been 10 degrees or more, and his breath came out in visible puffs of condensation that should not have been possible in the climate-controlled environment of the research station. The violet orbs winked out of existence all at once, like someone had flipped a switch and cut the power to whatever impossible force was keeping them suspended in midair and glowing with that eerie, otherworldly light that made his skin crawl. The woman rose to her feet in one fluid motion that was far too graceful to be human in her. Ceremonial robes fell around her like water cascading down a cliff face in slow motion, and Jake noticed that the fabric seemed to shimmer and change colors depending on the angle of the light. She spoke. Her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity, like he was standing too close to a massive speaker at a concert, and the words were in a language he had never heard before in his entire life, but somehow he understood them anyway, and that understanding terrified him almost as much as the dragon did. The woman said that he had defiled the communion and demanded to know if he had any comprehension of what he had interrupted with his careless intrusion into her sacred space, and the dragon punctuated her words With a low growl that sounded like distant thunder rolling across mountains, Jake tried to speak, but his mouth had gone completely dry, and his tongue felt like it had been replaced with sandpaper, and all he could manage was a weak, strangled sound. That was not quite words, and not quite a scream, but somewhere awkwardly in between, behind him in the corridor, he heard footsteps approaching rapidly as the rest of his team responded to the commotion and came to investigate what was happening. In the storage bay, and why Jake had gone silent on the communication channel, the woman studied him with an intensity that made Jake feel like an insect pinned to a board in a collection being examined under a microscope by a scientist who cared nothing for the comfort or dignity of the specimen and only wanted to catalog its features for future reference. The dragon unwound itself from around the woman and flowed across the floor like liquid shadow poured from a container, and it moved with a grace that should not have been possible for something with that many joints and that long a body it positioned itself between. Jake and the woman, with its lips peeled back to reveal teeth that gleamed like surgical steel, fresh from the sterilizer and sharp enough to cut through bone and metal with equal ease. Jake wanted to run, but his legs would not obey the commands.
Oh.
His brain was screaming at them, and he remained rooted to the spot like a tree that had grown there over decades and could not be moved by any force short of a nuclear explosion. Woman seemed to notice his fear, and something in her expression shifted slightly and became marginally less hostile, though no less intense or powerful, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its edge, but retained all of its commanding presence. She said her name was Lyra, and that he was Lieutenant Jake Morrison, though he had no idea how she knew his name and rank when they had never met before, and she had not been on any of the station manifests or personnel lists. Then she said something that made his blood run cold in his heart stop beating for several seconds before reluctantly starting again, because the alternative was death, and his body was not quite ready to give up on living just yet. She said that he had just started a war that his species was not prepared to fight, and that everything was about to change in ways that humans could not possibly understand or predict with their limited knowledge of the universe and the forces that governed it. Jake wanted to ask what she meant, and what war she was talking about, and why his accidental interruption of whatever ceremony she had been performing was important enough to threaten the entire human race with extinction or conquest or whatever terrible fate she was implying. But before he could form the words, his team burst through the door behind him with their own weapons drawn and their faces showing various expressions of shock and confusion and fear as they took in the impossible scene before them. The dragon hissed, and its scales bristled like the fur of an angry cat, and the air around it began to shimmer with heat or energy or some combination of both that made the sensors on the wall start beeping warning signals. Lyra raised one hand, and the dragon immediately fell silent and still, though its eyes never left the humans, and it remained coiled like a spring ready to launch itself at the first sign of threat or aggression. Then Lyra spoke again, and this time her words were directed at all of them, and not just Jake. And she explained that they needed to talk, and that what she had to tell them would change everything they thought they knew about the universe and humanity place in it. She said that time was short, and that forces were already in motion that would bring destruction to this world, and possibly to Earth itself, unless they could find a way to stop what had been set in motion. By one careless moment and one open door, Jake looked at his teammates and saw his own fear and confusion reflected back at him in their faces, and he knew that whatever came next would be unlike anything any of them had ever experienced or could have prepared for in their training. The dragon settled onto its haunches, kept watching them with those burning gold eyes that seemed to see right through flesh and bone to the very core of their souls and judge what it found there. Lyra gestured toward the conference room down the hall and said they should go there now and talk about what needed to happen next, and how they might possibly survive the storm that was coming. Jake felt like he was moving through a dream as he followed her down the corridor, with the dragon flowing along beside her like a loyal pet that just happened to be a creature of myth and legend. Brought to terrifying life, he wondered what he had done by opening that door, and what. The conference room had never felt so small and cramped, with all of them packed inside, along with the mysterious woman who called herself Lyra and her dragon companion, who sat beside her like a living shadow carved from darkness and starlight. Combined, Dr. Karen Walsh was the station. A xenobiologist, and she leaned forward across the table with excitement barely contained beneath her professional exterior as she studied their unexpected visitors with the intensity of someone who had just discovered something that would redefine their entire field of study. She asked Lyra about the war that had been mentioned and what war could possibly be connected to their remote research station where nothing important happened and nobody of significance ever came to visit. Lyra laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, and it made everyone in the room feel uncomfortable in ways they could not quite articulate or explain to each other. Later, when they tried to process what happened, she said that human instruments were blind to what truly mattered in the universe because they could only measure electromagnetic radiation and gravitational waves and other physical phenomena, but they could not perceive the currents of something she called the ethereal realm. The ethereal realm was a dimension that existed beneath and around and through the physical reality that humans experienced with their 5 basic senses, and it was like roots beneath a forest floor that nobody could see, but which connected everything together in ways that were invisible but absolutely vital. Lyra gestured with one hand, and the air above the conference table began to shimmer and distort, and an image formed hanging in empty space without any projector or screen or technology that anyone could identify. Image showed a massive structure floating in darkness, and it looked like someone had taken starlight and shadow and woven them together into architecture that should not have been possible according to any engineering principles that humans understood. She called it the Void Citadel and explained that for 10,000 cycles it had been the seat of power for something called the Dominion, which was a coalition of alien races who had discovered the ethereal realm long before humans had even learned to make fire or use tools. The Dominion maintained peace across vast regions of space through strength and through fear and through enforcement of a single law that could never be broken without terrible consequences. That law stated that no species anywhere was allowed to perform something called the bonding ritual, which created a permanent link between a sentient being and a creature from the ethereal realm. Like the dragon sitting beside Lorenia, who attempted the bonding ritual, was hunted down and eliminated without mercy or hesitation, and their home worlds were either quarantined forever or completely destroyed, depending on how serious the Dominion considered the violation to be. Jake felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized what Lyra was saying and what it meant for him and for everyone on the research station, and possibly for everyone on Earth. He said that she had been performing a ritual when he interrupted her, and Lyra nodded slowly with an expression that might have been sadness or regret or some emotion that humans did not have a word for. She confirmed that she had been performing the bonding ritual with her companion, whose name was Nyx, and they had been partners since they were both young. But the true bond required absolute concentration in perfect conditions that only occurred once per solar cycle. The ritual could only be attempted when the dimensional barriers between the physical realm and the ethereal realm were at their weakest point, and that happened rarely and according to patterns that took years to predict accurately. Jake had interrupted the ritual at the exact moment of completion, when the energies were flowing and the connection was forming, and the two souls were beginning to merge into something greater than either could be alone. The incomplete ritual had created dimensional rifts which were like tears in the fabric of reality itself, and these rifts sent ripples spreading out through the ethereal realm like waves on a pond after someone throws a stone into the water. Those ripples would reach the nearest Dominion outpost within 3 weeks, according to Lyra calculations, and when the Dominion detected them, they would immediately send investigators to find the source. When the investigators found evidence of an attempted bonding ritual, they would not care that it had been accidental or that it had failed to complete properly. Commander Helen Price was the station military liaison, and she had been silent up until this point. But now she spoke with a voice that was calm, but carried an undercurrent of barely controlled anger. She asked if Lyra was saying that because one of her men had walked through the wrong door at the wrong time. The entire human race had just been marked for destruction by an alien empire that Earth did not even know existed. Lyra stood up and Nyx flowed to the floor beside her, and the dragon seemed to blur at the edges like it was not quite solid or not quite real or existing in multiple places at the same time. She confirmed that the Dominion would sterilize everything within 100 light years of the research station to ensure that no trace of the forbidden knowledge survived, and they had done this before two civilizations that were older and more powerful than humanity. The room exploded into voices as everyone tried to talk at once, and fear and denial and anger all mixed together into a chaos of sound that made Nick's scales bristle with agitations. Jake found himself speaking without meaning to, and his voice cut through the noise, and he asked the only question that really mattered, which was how long they had before the Dominion. Lara looked at him, and he saw the weight of centuries in her golden eyes, and the knowledge of battles fought and lost, and the sorrow of someone who had lived too long and seen too much. She said that the dimensional rifts would reach the nearest outpost within 3 weeks, and the Dominion would investigate immediately, and she estimated they had 1 month before the fleets arrived, and possibly less if the Dominion decided the situation was critical. Karen said they needed to evacuate immediately and get everyone off the planet and back to Earth, where they could warn the authorities about what was coming. But Helen corrected her and said they needed to prepare for war, because if what Lyra was saying was true, then there was nowhere to evacuate to, since Earth was only 70 light years away, and well within the destruction zone. The silence that followed was broken only by Nick's low rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once and vibrate through the floor and walls. Lyra placed her hand on the dragon neck, and energy crackled between them like miniature lightning bolts, colored violet and gold and dancing across their skin. She said there was another option that might work if they were willing to take a desperate chance on something that had never been tried before. If the bonding ritual could be completed, then she and Nyx would gain powers sufficient to combat a small Dominion force, and they could fight a delaying action while the humans warned Earthen prepared defenses. But the ritual required the perfect, natural conditions, and those would not occur again for another solar cycle, which was far too long to wait. Jake asked if there was any way to artificially recreate those conditions and force the dimensional alignment to happen when they needed it, instead of waiting for nature to provide. Everyone looked at Karen, who had gone very pale and whose hands were shaking slightly as she processed what was being asked of her. She said it might be possible because the dimensional physics research they had been conducting at the station was all theoretical. But if what Lyra said about the rifts was true, then they could measure them and model them and possibly recreate the conditions. But she would need time to study Lyra and Nyx and understand the energies involved in the bonding process and figure out how to generate those energies artificially with equipment that was never designed for that purpose. Helen said that time was the one resource they did not have in abundance, but it was better than sitting around waiting to die without fighting back. She asked Lyra if she would help them, and if she would share the knowledge they needed to have even the smallest chance of surviving what was coming. Lyra looked at each person in the room, and her expression was difficult to read, but there was something like respect in her eyes. When she finally nodded and agreed, she said she would help them, but they needed to understand that even if they succeeded, and even if the bonding was completed and they somehow survived the first Dominion attack, there would be consequences. Once the Dominion knew that humans had allied with a bonded pair and had been exposed to forbidden knowledge, they would never stop hunting humanity, would trade 1 month of peace and ignorance for an eternity of war and vigilance and constant danger from an enemy that commanded resources beyond human comprehension. Jake thought about Earth and about all the people there who had no idea that their lives were about to change forever because of one open door and one interrupted ritual. He thought about his sister Amy, who lived in Seattle and worked as a teacher, and his nephew, who was 5 years old and loved dinosaurs and spaceships and had no idea that real aliens existed. He thought about all the ordinary people living ordinary lives and going to work and raising families and planning for futures that might never come if the Dominion could not be stopped. Then he looked at Lyra and at Nyx and at his teammates, and he made a decision that he knew would haunt the research station. Transformed over the following weeks as every corridor was repurposed and every piece of equipment was retasked toward the single, desperate goal of completing the bonding Ritual before the Dominion arrived, Karen team worked. Day and night without rest, mapping the dimensional rifts with instruments that had never been designed to measure such strange phenomena and cobbling together theories from scattered observations and Lyra cryptic explanations. Jake was assigned as Lyra liaison, which meant he was responsible for translating her requests into terms that human scientists could understand, and apparently his accidental interruption had created some kind of connection between them. They sat together often in the observation dome, where the crystal forests of the planet spread out below them in patterns that seemed to shift and change. When nobody was looking directly at them, Nyx would lie coiled at Lyra's feet, breathing slowly and rhythmically in a way that seemed almost meditative, and Jake had learned that the dragon was far more intelligent than any Earth animal. Sometimes he would catch Nyx watching him with those burning golden eyes, and he wondered what the creature thought about humans and whether it judged them worthy of saving. Jake asked Lyra to tell him about the Dominion and what they were really like beyond the warnings and the scary stories that made them sound like unstoppable monsters. Lyra was quiet for a long time with her fingers absently stroking Nyx's scales, and the dragon made a sound like wind chimes being played by a storm. She said the Dominion was what happened when fear became law, and when the need for safety became more important than freedom or growth or the natural evolution of civilizations 10,000 cycles ago. The first bonding had occurred naturally and accidentally when a young scholar found a wounded creature from the ethereal realm and nursed it back to health. The gratitude and connection between them had triggered a spontaneous bond that granted them powers beyond anything anyone had seen before. They could manipulate dimensional energies directly and reshape matter with focused thought and perceive futures that might happen and pasts that could have been different. Terrified everyone else because suddenly one individual had power equivalent to entire armies, and nobody knew how to control or predict or defend against someone who could bend reality itself where it's broke out. As different species rushed to replicate the bonding and gain the same advantages for themselves, and entire star systems were destroyed, and the conflicts that followed the Dominion was formed by the survivors who had lost the most in those wars, and who had seen their worlds burned and their civilizations reduced to ashes. By the chaos of uncontrolled bonding, they hunted down every bonded pair they could find and destroyed every record and every scrap of knowledge about how the ritual worked. When they thought they had succeeded, they established the law that no new bondings would ever be permitted, and anyone who tried would be eliminated along with anyone who helped them. Jake said it sounded like they were trying to prevent another catastrophe, and Lyra nodded, but her expression was sad. She explained that the Dominion had become the very thing they were created to prevent, because they maintained peace through threats and surveillance and the promise of overwhelming destruction. There were species under Dominion rule who were not allowed to develop certain technologies or ask certain questions or explore certain ideas because the Dominion decided their knowledge was too dangerous. Nyx raised its head and looked at Jake, and when it spoke, its voice was like crystals singing in harmony, and the sound seemed to bypass his ears entirely and speak directly into his mind. The dragon said that the Dominion feared what they could not control, and they feared bonded pairs because they represented change and evolution and the possibility that the universe could be different than what fear dictated. Jake jerked back in surprise because he had not known the dragon could speak, and Nyx made a sound that might have been laughter. Lyra explained that Nyx could only speak to those she permitted, and only when the message was important enough to justify the energy required. Before Jake could respond, alarms started blaring throughout the station, and Helen's voice came over the intercom. Sharp with urgency, she said they had incoming contacts emerging from dimensional rifts at the edge of the system, and they would arrive at the station in 6 hours. Jake felt his blood turn cold because they were not ready, and the artificial dimensional alignment was still days away from being complete. Lyra stood in her robes, billowed around her even though there was no wind, and she said they were Dominion scouts who must have detected the rifts earlier than expected. She told Nyx it was time to show the humans what a partially bonded pair could do, even without the full power of a complete ritual. Jake asked what she meant by partially bonded, and Lyra explained as they hurried toward the command center the interrupted ritual had created an incomplete connection between her and Nyx, and they could share some thoughts and pool some energies, but nothing compared to what a true bond would grant. Against scouts it would be enough, but against what would come after the scouts if she failed, it would be meaningless. The command center was chaos when they arrived, with screens showing tactical displays and red icons representing the incoming ships. Current reported massive energy signatures unlike anything human technology could produce, and the ships were literally folding space around themselves. Using the dimensional substrate as a highway, Helen asked how many ships there were, and Karen said 6 contacts confirmed, and based on their energy output, they were heavily armed frigates. Helen jaw tightened, and she asked if the station defense satellites would be effective, and Karen shook her head. The energy shielding the Dominion ships used existed partially in the ethereal realm, which meant conventional human weapons would pass through without causing damage. Lyra said they needed weapons that could affect both realms simultaneously, and she was the only weapon available. Shay moved to the center of the room with Nyx at her side, and together they began to glow with violet light pouring from the dragon and gold light radiating from Leoratha. 2 colors swirled around them in patterns that hurt to look at directly, and Jake felt his eyes watering from the intensity. Leorath said she would meet the Dominion ships in space, and by Karen the time needed to prepare the artificial alignment. Jake protested that she could not go out there alone against 6 ships. When she admitted herself that she was only partially bonded, Lyra smiled, and it was the saddest expression Jake had ever seen on another person's face. She said she had been alone for longer than human civilization had existed, and this was what she had been preparing for since she was young enough to believe one person could make a difference. The light around her and Nyx intensified until it was almost blinding, and then impossibly they simply were not there anymore. Tactical display showed a new icon appearing halfway between the station and the incoming Dominion scouts, and it was a single point of violet and gold light. Helen ordered the screen magnified, and everyone watched as Lyra appeared floating in the vacuum of space with Nyx coiled around her like a living shield. Both of them were wreathed in energy that made space itself ripple and distort. Invisible waves, the Dominion ships closed to weapons range, and Lyra raised one hand, and lightning leaped from her fingers, arcing across thousands of kilometers to strike the lead frigate. The ship shields flared and absorbed most of the strike, but cracks appeared in the dimensional barrier, and the frigate returned fire with beams of coherent energy, moved faster than Jake's eyes could follow, and intercepted the beams with its body, and the dragon scales drank in the energy and reflected it back as waves of destructive force. And whispered that the power readings were off every scale they had, and Lyra was generating energy equivalent to a small star with precision that should not be physically possible. Helen said quietly that Lyra was burning herself out, and every strike was costing her, and she was buying them time with her own life. Jake watched, unable to look away, as Lyra and Nyx fought between the frigates like dancers in a deadly ballet. Collapsed the dimensional rift onto one ship and tore it in half, and Nyx breathed what looked like concentrated void, that unmade matter at the molecular level. But there were too many ships, and they adapted quickly and learned to coordinate their attacks. Energy beams converged on Lyra from multiple angles and forced her to defend instead of attack, and Nyx roared with a sound that somehow carried through vacuumna. Dragon unleashed everything it had in one massive explosion of purple fire that consumed 2 frigates instantly, but the effort left Nyx limp and drained, and Lyra caught the dragon and held it close, while her own light flickered like a dying candle. Remaining frigates moved in for the kill, and Jake felt helpless watching from the safety of the station. Then Karen screamed in triumph and said she had the calculations and they could recreate the dimensional alignment she needed. Lyra back at the station immediately, and everyone else needed to evacuate to minimum safe distance. Helen ordered the evacuation and sent a recall signal to Lyra while coordinating the retreat to the escape pods. Jake ran toward the docking bay, knowing logically there was nothing he could do, but unable to stay and watch Lyra die alone in space behind him. Helen was giving orders and buying seconds and minutes with careful coordination. The dimensional alignment chamber that Karen's team had built looked more like abstract art than scientific equipment, with crystal structures harvested from the planet forests, forming a framework around the central platform power cores from the station generator formed a ring around the platform, and they had been modified to release their energy in a precisely timed cascade that would hopefully recreate the natural conditions needed for the bonding ritual. Karen had been working for 3 weeks straight with barely any sleep, and her hands shook from exhaustion as she made final adjustments to the equipment. Lyra materialized in the center of the chamber, holding Nyx in her arms, and both of them looked diminished and faded like candles that had burned too long and were about to go out. Burns marked Lyra's skin, where Dominion weapons had found their targets, and Nyx's scales were cracked and dull, with wisps of ethereal energy leaking out like blood from wounds. She reported that the frigates were regrouping and reinforcements were coming through the dimensional currents, and they had perhaps 1 hour before overwhelming force arrived. Curran said they needed to do the ritual immediately and positioned Lyra at the exact center of the platform, with Nyx coiled beside her. The energies had to flow through both of them simultaneously, and if either moved even slightly during the process, everything could collapse. Catastrophically Cut helped Lyra to the platform and supported her when her legs threatened to give out, and up close, he could see how much the battle had cost her. She looked ancient now, with exhaustion that went far deeper than merely physical. And Jake asked quietly if this would work. Lyra admitted she did not know, because the natural alignment was the product of orbital mechanics and dimensional harmonics that had been building for an entire solar cycle. This artificial version was crude and forced, and it might kill them or do nothing, or possibly grant them the power they needed. Jake said that was not much pressure, and Lyra laughed weakly, and the sound turned into a cough. She said humans had a gift for humor in dark moments, and she had encountered hundreds of civilizations and thought humanity might actually survive because they were adaptable and creative and apparently too stubborn to accept reality as given. Jake told her to call him by his first name, because if they were starting an eternal war together, they should probably be on first name basis. She repeated his name, testing how it sounded, and then stepped onto the platform with Nyx flowing beside her. Something passed between woman and dragon that was beyond words or even thoughts, and Lyra thanked Jake for trying to help. Then Karan's voice cut through the moment and warned Jake to clear the chamber because the dimensional energies would tear apart anything organic that got too close. Jake backed toward the door reluctantly, and Helen met him in the corridor with her. Face grim, she reported that evacuation was complete and everyone was in escape pods, ready to launch, and the frigates were holding position, waiting for reinforcements. Lyra had said they had maybe an hour, and Helen hoped desperately that the ritual would work in time through the reinforced window. Jake watched as Karen initiated the sequence, and the power cores began to glow brighter and brighter. Energy flowed into the crystal framework, and the air inside the chamber started to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Space itself began bending and twisting inside. The chamber, like reality, was made of glass that was being heated to its melting point. Lyra and Nyx stood at the center of everything, and their forms became indistinct. As dimensional boundaries blurred and overlapped, violet light erupted from Nyx, with intensity that cast shadows moving independently of any light source. Gold radiance poured from Lyra and intertwined with the purple and spiraling patterns that became more complex with each passing second. The chamber instruments went completely haywire, with needles pinned at maximum readings and digital displays showing errors or numbers too large to process. Curran said it was working, and the dimensional alignment was stabilizing, and the energies were flowing through them and rewriting quantum signatures at the most fundamental level. She said it was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and something that should not be possible according to everything science understood about reality. Then the world exploded into pure light that blinded everyone watching. Jake was thrown backward and slammed into the corridor wall with his vision completely seared. White alarms screamed throughout the station, warning of dimensional breaches and catastrophic energy surges, and reality itself coming loose from its foundations. He felt more than heard a roar that existed in dimensions human senses were not equipped to process, and it resonated in his bones and imprinted spaces between thoughts. When his vision finally cleared, The chamber was transformed with the crystal framework melted into puddles and the power cores. Drained to empty husks, at the center of the platform where Lyra and Nyx had stood, there was something. New and impossible. Shay rose slowly, and Jake's mind struggled to understand what his eyes reported because it was Lyra, but also fundamentally different and transcendent her. Hair floated around her head in a corona of living starlight that moved with its own internal currents. Her eyes burned like twin suns, too bright to look at directly but impossible to look away from. Patterns of light moved beneath her skin like circuitry made from condensed reality itself, mapping connections to dimensions that Jake could not perceive or understand. Nyx had grown, but not in physical size, and instead in presence, and the dragon was simultaneously more solid and more ethereal than before. Its scales reflected not just light, but possibility itself, and showed glimpses of futures that might be, and pasts that could have been, and presence existing in quantum superposition. When it moved, it left after images that persisted for several heartbeats, like echoes in space-time that refused to fade immediately. Lyra spoke, and her voice carried harmonics that made the station hall ring like a giant bell being struck. She said the bonding was complete, and she could feel connections opening, and pathways forming, and power flowing through every cell and every Nyx and her were one now, but not merged, and instead unified, with each retaining individual identity while sharing everything else. So it was more than she had ever imagined possible, and the sensation was overwhelming and intoxicating and terrifying all at once. She raised one hand, and reality bent around her fingers like she was pushing against fabric instead of the fundamental structure of existence. A tear opened in space, but not a crude rip like the accidental rifts from before, and instead a precise incision carved with surgical precision through the opening. Jake could see the Dominion frigates closer now, with their weapons charging for another attack. Lyra said they knew what had happened, and the reinforcements had arrived with 12 dreadnoughts and 3 carrier groups. It was enough firepower to sterilize an entire star system and leave nothing but radiation and debris. They were transmitting demands for surrender, and for Lyra execution, and for destruction of all knowledge related to the bonding. Helen asked what their chances were, and her hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm. Even though it would be useless, Lyra smiled, and it was like watching a star being born with light and heat and transformative energy radiating outward. She said before the bonding they would have had no chance at all, and would have been erased from existence without anyone remembering they existed. Ash! She was fully bonded now, with the complete and perfect connection that the Dominion had feared for 10,000 cycles. She stepped through the portal with Nyx beside her, and both radiated power that made the Dominion fleet sensors scream warnings. Jake called out that she could not fight them all alone, but Lyra looked back with compassion in her burning eyes. She said she was not alone, because she had Nyx, and through their bond, they had strength of 2 souls, perfectly aligned. More importantly, she had something the Dominion had forgotten, which was a reason to fight beyond mere survival. She fought for Jake, and for humanity, and for all civilizations. The Dominion had crushed beneath their fear. She told Jake to tell his people what happened here, and that humanity stood at extinction edge and chose to fight. Rather than submit, the portal closed and left Jake staring at empty space where she had been standing outside. Through the station windows they watched as a single point of violet and gold light accelerated toward a fleet that should have crushed it instantly. What followed was not really a battle, but instead a revelation of what true power looked like when unleashed without restraint or mercy. The recorded footage would be studied by military strategists and physicists for generations, as they tried to understand frame by frame what they were witnessing in the space above the research station. But in the moment, as Jake and the remaining crew watched Lyra and Nyx engage the massive Dominion fleet, understanding was less important than simple, overwhelming awe at the display of power. She moved through space like a dancer, or like a force of nature, or like something that had transcended normal rules of physics entirely. The Dominion dreadnoughts were massive armored citadels, bristling with enough weapons to destroy planets. But Lyra was fluid motion and focused intent. Nyx coiled around her in patterns that defied 3-dimensional geometry, and the dragon existed in multiple locations simultaneously, like quantum probability made into living flesh. The first dreadnought opened fire with everything it possessed, including beams of concentrated energy and missiles that warped. Space and exotic weapons from theoretical physics Lyra raised one hand casually, and the attack simply stopped frozen in space. Like insects trapped in amber, or time itself had been paused. She examined the frozen weapons with idle curiosity, like a scientist studying specimens, and then flicked her wrist dismissively. Weapons reversed course, moving backward through time and unfiring, and unlaunching until they were safely stored in the Dreadnought magazines again, except now they were armed and primed, and the Dreadnought realized its fatal mistake. One split second before its own weapons detonated inside its hold, a massive vessel tore itself apart from within, and the explosion bloomed like a temporary sun, casting harsh shadows across everything nearby. Helen whispered that Lyra had reversed causality itself and made the ship destroy itself with weapons. It had not yet fired, Karen said with a hoarse voice, that the bonding let Lyra manipulate fundamental fabric of spacetime and reach into the ethereal realm to rewrite reality. Rules. The Dominion fleet adapted their tactics quickly and spread out, creating overlapping fields of fire. It's designed to saturate space with so much destruction that nothing could possibly deflect. Carrier groups launched thousands of small fighters, moving in perfect coordination, attempting to overwhelm through pure numbers. Nyx roared, and the sound carried through vacuum and through dimensions that had no sound at all. The dragon unfolded and expanded until it was larger than the dreadnoughts, with scales spreading out like solar panels, catching ethereal energies. Fighter swarms hit an invisible barrier and simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but retroactively unmade with their... The entire timeline collapsed. Nyx breathed, and what emerged was not fire or plasma, but pure entropy that aged one carrier group a billion years in mere seconds. Metal corroded and energy systems failed, and crew members crumbled to dust as the entire ship died of extreme old age, compressed into heartbeats. Jake watched in fascinated horror as Lyra pointed at another dreadnought, and it folded in on itself with dimensions collapsing inward. Space and time compressed until the massive vessel was reduced to a singularity no larger than a marble floating in her palm. She studied it for a moment, like examining a curious trinket, and then released it. The singularity exploded backward through time, with energy expanding and dispersing until it was nothing but whispers of exotic particles that never quite managed to become a ship. Jake said that she was not just fighting them, but unmaking them and erasing them from existence. Like they never were. Helen said grimly that the Dominion was learning why they made the bonding forbidden, because fully bonded pairs were not just powerful. They were reality warpers and causality violators, and beings existing partially outside normal flow of time and space. They were gods in what use did. Gods have 4 laws made by mortals who feared what they could not control or understand. The battle, if it could even be called, that lasted exactly 17 minutes from start to finish. When it ended, the Dominion fleet was gone, not destroyed in any conventional sense, but unmade and scattered across timelines and dimensions that might never exist. They were reduced to quantum uncertainty and collapse probability functions and mathematical abstractions that no longer had physical form. Only one ship remained intact, because Lyra had deliberately spared it and marked it with her power, so every sensor would forever remember what happened. She appeared on the frigate bridge, materializing in a column of violet and gold light that made the crew scramble for weapons they knew were useless. Nyx manifested beside her, and the dragon presence filled the small space with terrible majesty that made grown warriors weep. When Lyra spoke, her words were recorded by ship systems and transmitted back to Dominion Central Authority and broadcast across 100 worlds. She said her name was Lyra Silverbranch, and she was the first true bonded in 10,000 cycles. Nyx was her companion, an equal and other self, and together they were one, and they were legion. She told them to inform the Dominion that the age of fear was over, and from this day forward, any species wishing to pursue bonding would be free to do so. She and Nyx would defend their right to make that choice against anyone who tried to stop them through violence or threats. She smiled, and it was terrible and beautiful simultaneously, like watching creation and destruction happening at the same time. She said that if the Dominion came for humanity again, or threatened her, allies or tried to enforce their ancient laws through force, she would come to their citadel. She would stand before their council and show them exactly what one truly bonded pair could accomplish when pushed beyond all tolerance. The frigate crew could say nothing and could only watch as Lyra and Nyx vanished, returning to normal space. She reappeared on the research station in the observation dome, where everything had begun weeks earlier. Jake was already there, having somehow known where she would arrive, and Lyra looked tired now, with the glow of power fading to something more sustainable. Nyx had shrunk back to original size, coiled at her feet, and the dragon looked as exhausted as its bonded companion. Lyra said simply that it was done, and the message had been sent, and within days the entire Dominion would know what happened. Some would call for total war and demand humanity be exterminated as an example to other species. Others would be more cautious, remembering the fleet that was unmade and wondering if revenge was worth the cost. Jake asked what she thought they would do, and Lyra said they would probably negotiate Arenies. Faced with power they could not control, always chose negotiation over mutual destruction. She moved to the window, looking out at crystal forests glowing in the red sunlight. She said humanity would have time now to prepare and learn and decide what role they wanted in a galaxy about to undergo revolutionary change other species would seek. The bonding now inspired by what she had done, and some would succeed and some would fail, but the knowledge could not be suppressed anymore, and the universe was changing whether the Dominion accepted it or not. Jake asked if she would stay and help, then prepare for what was coming. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, and then Nyx raised its head, and both looked at Jake with identical expressions of gentle regret. She said they could not stay because the bonding granted immense power, but also demanded immense responsibility. They needed to find others like them who had been hiding for millennia and establish guidelines to ensure new bonded did not become the very thing the Dominion feared. Jake said that power corrupts, and Lyra corrected him that power reveals the bonding did not change who you were, but amplified what was always there and removed limitations that kept true. Nature constrained, they needed to ensure those seeking it understood the burden as well as the gift. She turned to face him, and in fading light, she looked achingly mortal and achingly alone despite her bond with Nyx. She said she would visit when possible and bring news of the wider galaxy and teach human scientists what they needed. He had saved her life through his ingenuity and refusal to accept defeat, and that was a debt she intended to spend a very long time repaying. Jake protested that they had not saved her, and she had saved them by fighting for humanity. Lyra said he had opened a door at the wrong moment, and in doing so, changed the course of history. Ever underestimate power of small actions, because sometimes the universe pivots on a single choice or moment of curiosity. And Nyx began glowing again, preparing to depart, and Jake felt desperate. Need to say something profound in the end? All he could manage was a simple thank you. Lyra echoed his thanks, and then she was gone, leaving only whispers of violet and gold light fading like dreams. Upon waking, Jake stood alone in the observation dome. For a long time, watching stars and thinking about doors and destinies below him, crystal forests swayed in gentle winds, unchanged by all that had transpired, and indifferent to the fact that this world had become birthplace of revolution somewhere. Distant, the evacuation pods were returning with crew, who had witnessed humanity first contact with powers beyond imagination. They would have questions and demands for explanations and desperate need to understand what they had seen. Jake would help them as best he could, and write reports and give testimony and try to convey magnitude of what one accident had set in motion. But for now, in this moment, he simply stood and watched stars and wondered what new doors waited to be opened. What other accidents of fate would shape humanity's path through a universe suddenly revealed to be larger and stranger than anyone dared dream.